like also to welcome everyone, and we are ready. We will start in a moment. I have a slight problem. I don't know why with my connection, and but my associates will inform me if it's going to be difficult, if I will have problems in my connection and if you can't attend me very well. But we will try to make the best to present the conclusions of the program. So I would like, first of all, to introduce you to my associates in this research program, the research program that we have just completed. It's a program that it was funded by the Hellenic Foundation for Research and Innovation and from the General Secretariat of Research and Technology. And it was administered by the Aristotle University of Thessaloniki. So my associates in the program were Ms. Angeliki Gavriloglu. Raise your hand, please, dear. Who is a PhD candidate at the Freie University of Berlin. Mr. Nikos Kekeris, who is a PhD candidate of law in the Aristotle University of Thessaloniki. And Ms. Xenia Eleftheriou. Xenia, if you can raise your hand, so the rest of the attendees can see you. And Ms. Xenia Eleftheriou is a PhD candidate also at the Aristotle University of Thessaloniki. And it was also an associate, Sofia Christoforidou, that couldn't attend today's event. Originally, the proposal for this research program was conducted by Dr. Leon Saltiel, who was the first scientific supervisor. But Leon has resigned from his position for personal reasons. So I took over the responsibility for this research program in November 2019. And more or less, it's a program that it's quite challenging because it has to do with the Jewish fortunes, the Jewish properties in Thessaloniki. It's a hot issue in the city, and over the last years we witnessed an emergence of the interest about the Jewish history of Salonika, of the Jewish community that was perished at a great percentage in the Holocaust. And the case we used in order to have a pattern to see how it will be more, let's say, to have a more clear evidence of what has happened. We had a case study of two streets of Thessaloniki. The one street is Venizelou. Venizelou is a central commercial street of Thessaloniki still, and it was actually the busiest commercial center of Salonika. And we have also the case study of Niaouli Street, who is still a small street on the eastern part of Thessaloniki, and used to be at the core of a neighborhood that it was with mixed population, but the majority of the population was Jewish. So this street, Niaouli, along with Mizrahi Street, they all led to Baron Hirsch Hospital, and all that created a neighborhood that was inhabited by middle and low class citizens. Most of them, they were Jews. So what we did is that we tried, although we had the problems with the pandemic, we tried to research as more archives that we could in order to have a more concrete result. We researched at the Jewish Museum of Thessaloniki, at the Historical Archive of the Jewish community of Thessaloniki. And most important was at the Central Board of the Jewish Communities of Greece, that the archive of the Organization for the Relief and Rehabilitation for the Jews of Greece is held And this was the key archive that we managed to research in order to cross-check all the cases that we have to identify what has happened. So to make, not to lose so much time in the introduction, I will give the insight of the program, what we did, what we checked, how the history went, and how eventually we reached in the outcome that we had. The point is that to make a small introduction about what happened is that in 1941, Greece suffered a triple occupation by Italy, Greece, and Bulgaria. And Thessaloniki was part of the German zone. The point is that after the end of the war, although that we have the laws that were supposed that they were hypothetically enforced to return back the Jewish properties, this didn't happen. And this contributed significantly in the public history of what happened with the Jewish assets. So I will begin, and then I will ask my associates to give a brief outlook of their work as well. We will try to be brief and not so you won't get bored. And please, if you would have questions, write them down in the chat, or after the end of our small lectures, we will try to find a way that you can raise your hand and we will unmute your microphones to ask your questions. So to begin, let me just give me a second, please. Okay, first of all, we need to elucidate something when we talk about the fortunes, because it's quite important and it's something that it needs to be clarified. In the Jewish case, this distinction refers to the movable and immovable assets. For the former, we talk about everything that can be considered as moving values, moving wealth, whether this has to do with valuables such as money, deposits, stocks, jewelry, or it has to do with goods, such as households. What the house includes merchandise, commodities, professional and industrial equipment, when we talk about professional and commercial activities, from small shops and crafts to big industries and warehouses. For the immovable wealth, we talk about the Jewish real estate properties. And this is a key issue in our research. While the latter, the Jewish real estate, can be considered the most important, I have to say that the former, the movable wealth, can be estimated at an equally important value. In Thessaloniki, we had, for instance, warehouses or storage rooms of a fairly low real estate value that had merchandise and goods of some millions of drachmas value, and where everything was lost. The same applied for shops, and especially crafts and industries, many of whom, especially the latter, were housed in light and inexpensive constructions, but the merchandise, raw materials, and professional equipment tools they had was of a multiple value to the real estate one. So, as we all know, since 1941, as I said, Greece suffered the triple occupation. And in February 1943, we had the last phase of the Jewish drama in the city with the arrival of Eichmann's people, Dieter Wislicheny and Alois Brunner, and the enforcement, the enact of the racial legislation. Among the provisions of the racial decrees was the obligatory declaration of all Jewish wealth, of all Jewish property. So in the first week of March, all Jews over 18 years old, they had to declare their personal wealth and fill in a specific statement. This property declaration had various chapters to be filled in, like real estate ownership, a house or a plot. It was another chapter for profession, working capital and company stocks and shares, another one for professional equipment and storage rooms, another one for cash, bank deposits and stocks, valuables and jewelry that it was of great importance for the Germans, and even the pets they probably owned. Some thousands of declarations were filled out, and the Germans by that already had an idea about the volume of the Jewish growth in the city. Only 4,000 declarations, around 4,000 were saved out of all these that were estimated to be around 12,000. The Germans, at the same time, ordered the Greek authorities to set up an agency to administer the Jewish property on behalf of the Greek state. This was IDIP. I will use the term IDIP. It was the Service for the Disposal of Jewish Property. Appointed in charge was a civil servant called Elias Douros. He was supervised by a board, but the truth is that the Germans had almost full control of the situation. The establishment of IDIP was the first step for the Aryanization plan of the Jewish properties, and the Germans, that was their goal, opened the circle of complicity involving the Greek public authorities and local actors as the professional chambers of Thessaloniki. They would be followed by some thousands of Greek Christians that willingly, either by need or by greed, they participated in the expropriation of the Jewish assets. To understand the urgency, but also the illegal status of IDIP, is that the specific public agency started its activities by the third week of March. The deportation started on the 15th, just a week after the first train departed for Auschwitz. On the third week of March, but officially, IDIP was established with a decree in June, 3 months after the start of its operation. Okay, so officially, its official cover pattern was 3 months after its official the start of its operation. Temporary staff and permanent public servants, along with evaluators, constituted teams of 2-3 persons on behalf of IDIP and proceeded in inventories of all the Jewish commercial properties, stores, shops, stockrooms, warehouses, factories, offices, everything, practically. Here I have to point out that this procedure had to do not only with Jewish-owned real estate, but with both owned and rented, leased commercial outlets. The same applied for the Jewish houses, where we had both owned and rented houses, apartments, flats, etc. Concerning the Jewish residences, it was a huge variety from mansions to plain little houses or even shacks, like barracks. All of those Jewish-owned or not owned professional commercial establishments and households were placed by the German occupation authorities at the administration of IDIP. For the housing, also other Greek public agencies were involved, such as the housing agency. The inventories started immediately with the creation of IDIP. Excuse me, let me check something. We are recording. Yes, excuse me about this break. The inventory started immediately with the establishment of IDIP. The procedure to follow was complete inventory of each Jewish establishment by a specific team. Due to the huge inflation rate during the occupation, the evaluation of the goods and of the equipment was conducted both in pre-war and occupation period values. After the inventory, the stores and commercial establishments were supposed to be sealed and locked and the keys to be delivered to IDIP. The next step was all Jewish outlets to be given to individuals or agencies that were named as caretakers or trustees or custodians. we will use these terms for this in our lectures. These caretakers, trustees, had to pay a rent to EDIP at the benefit of the Greek state. All money were hypothetically were going in one bank account in the Agricultural Bank of Greece. And they were accountable for the management of the Jewish premises and their contexts, these caretakers. The same more or less applied for the Jewish houses. Since this was a profitable operation, scores of people tried to be appointed as evaluators and mainly as caretakers. Queues of people gathered in EDIP, and the Germans supervised and guided the whole operation. The best out of the Jewish establishments were given to collaborators and associates of the Germans, like Laskaris Papanaum or Georgios Poulos. The Germans themselves participated in this procedure, either individually or as whole agencies. The professional chambers more or less did the same for their own benefit, and actually no order was kept. Since there was no legal frame for these activities, and we should point out the terminology used by the Greek authorities to dress up the whole operation. According to these terms, the Jewish properties were characterized as abandoned, and the Jewish proprietor who were deported as migrated or settled abroad. This was a continuous, it was repeated continuously in all the documents of the Greek state bureaucracy. To give in a few words the existing situation at that time, a general plunder was noted. Individuals and groups of people stormed the houses and the stores, looting everything. The German authorities threatened with executions on the spot to stop this anarchy. Contrary, they promoted order so the whole procedure would be more official and more proper, the expropriation. If the Jewish professional or housing establishment were giving at a fairly close time frame after the inventory was conducted, then the possibilities of being intact were a lot more. There should be no doubt that all of these were given to Greek collaborators of the Germans and associates of the people in charge of the Greek local authorities. Hundreds of Greeks were asking from Maximilian Merten, the German administrator and key figure of the Jewish affairs during this period, to be appointed as trustees, as custodians. The same illegal situation was noted during the inventories, where many of the evaluators were bribed to give false numbers and less total values. To a great extent, rents weren't paid to EDIP, and even in 1946, that the agency still operated, that practically means 2 years after the end of the war in Greece, claimed to the Greek occupants and caretakers, EDIP, to pay their debt as of 4 or 5 years unpaid rents. If the Jewish establishments, professional or houses, were giving after some period of time, 9 out of 10, they were plundered. In some cases, in the first inventory, thousands of products and goods were registered, and in the second inventory, in order to be handed to the appointee trustee, custodian, nothing was found, only equipment at the best of the occasions. Of course, we have to point out that in some cases, but not of a significant value, displaced persons, mainly from the Bulgarian occupation zone, Drama, Seres, and Kavala, or other parts of Macedonia, were appointed as custodians, caretakers, people in need. So it was basically the excuse that it was used. The same applied in the Jewish houses. Such cases were located in Miaouli Street, that it's among the 2 streets that we have our case study. According to the facts, the houses that were handed over to the families were already looted, and only a few of them had any furniture and household items. Since in 1943, and after the Italian armistice, the Germans declared full occupation of the country, except of the Bulgarian zone. So they constituted a central administrative body known as KIDIP, Central Service for the Disposal of Jewish Property, again, a Greek agency, a Greek public agency that was established in 1944 and superseded the framework of KIDIP in Thessaloniki. KIDIP was actually responsible for the assets all over Greece. So the interesting point, though, is after the war. Immediately after the retreat of the Germans and the liberation of Greece, by the end of October 1944, the new Greek government, the liberation government, discarded the occupation legislation and aimed to restore the Jewish properties to their former owners and the Jewish communities in the country. Also, KIDIP was renamed as the Central Service for the Clearing and Reimbursement of Jewish Properties and continued administering the Jewish properties and appointing custodians even in 1945, 1946, after the end of the war. Despite the new legal provisions that Nikos Kekeris, our associate in the program, would talk about immediately after the realization of the magnitude of the crime, beyond that, of the crime against the Jews and the plunder of their properties, the return process proved to be extremely difficult. The long-suffering survived Jews, less than 2,000 people, returned back to Thessaloniki out of a population of 50,000 people, and the Jewish community of Thessaloniki that struggled to find the needing resources to care for them had to deal with unfavorable bureaucracy, court rulings, and legal obstacles. Meanwhile, the local press of the time revealed that anti-Semitism was still vivid. This was a fact, actually, not only in Greece, but in many European countries that had to deal with the issue of the expropriation and confiscation of the Jewish properties. I will give a brief example. At the time, the Jewish community was struggling to support the survivors of the Holocaust in Thessaloniki. The communal property was confiscated. So the Burla synagogue was turned during the war and immediately after the war continued to be a tavern with live music that was named Nirvana. It was the Nirvana like the public authorities that they had. When the community demanded from the local authorities the synagogue to be evacuated so it can accommodate some of the penniless Jews, the Christian bishop asked a favor, the evacuation to be postponed, otherwise the people of the tavern would be left unemployed. So they had real obstacles to face in this effort. The same applied, especially in the Jewish houses, since many displaced and refugee families lived there. Since there was a housing crisis, the authorities were unwilling to enforce order to return the houses to the original owners or their heirs. So which were the reactions? Concerning the reactions towards the prospect for the restitution of the Jewish properties, those who had received Jewish real estate, houses and shops, showed soon the reluctance to return it. The strongest reactions came from people that were associated with the collaborationist regime or whose financial stake actually was high. The continuous anti-Semitism was unveiled in several cases, although the horrible crime of the Jewish genocide was already revealed. For instance, hostile press reports appeared when the Jewish community demanded the return of a chandelier that had been found in a church on the eastern part of the city that was originally belonged to the looted Sarfati synagogue. The reactions, more or less, were expected. The first union of custodian trustees was formed as early as 1943, and its president of this Union was among the few to be sentenced after the war. The truth is that immediately after the liberation, many of the custodians were imprisoned or they held as accountable for collaborationism. It was the first period that the same applied for many in most of the European countries. But soon after, the situation altered. The country, Greece, was already in a great political division, a turmoil that eventually would lead to this bloody civil war that we had from 1946 to 1949. Out of the more than 175 trial cases and 780 people accused or persecuted for collaborationism associated with expropriation of Jewish properties, less than 35 people were sentenced. This was in general the outcome of the trials for the Greek collaborators. At the same time, there was an ongoing witch hunt for communists, and the Jews were a target since many of those who have survived made it by joining the resistance in the mountains. A number of Jews was persecuted as communists and sent to exile, or they were imprisoned. All the activities of the Jewish communities and the survivors were monitored by the Greek gendarmerie for possible communist activities. During the elections in 1946, it was the first elections that we have 10 years after. The last elections were held in Greece in 1935. So the first elections after the end of the war, and more than 10 years that we didn't have, during these elections, the Communist Party, that it was just before the beginning of the Civil War, has asked from his supporters to abstain from the elections. Numerous police reports referred to the Jewish activities for communist liaisons and the Jewish and the Alien Security Service, which was accountable for the Greek Jews, knew who voted and who didn't. And this was practically what was happening, a complete monitoring of all Jewish activities. On the other hand, Auschwitz survivors that had suffered the most were obliged, upon their return from the death camps, to fulfill their military service, and they were enlisted for 3 or 4 years, and they were sent up to the front to fight in the Civil War. That's why also we witnessed the case that many Greek Jewish men left immediately when they returned from Auschwitz, or they tried to leave to go to Palestine in order to escape from enlisting in the Greek army. In 1947, a report by the Greek Ministry of Foreign Affairs noted that less than 60 to 100 Jewish professional establishments, commercial establishments, were returned to the Jewish owners or their heirs. Practically, that was 2.5 years after the liberation of the country. Although there were court decisions ruling in favor for the return of the properties, they were postponed by the intervention of the Ministry of Justice. Due to this chaotic situation, as the report mentioned, many of the Jewish claimants sold their rights at a rather symbolic price and migrated to Palestine. Same time-wise, the Greek police suggested to possible Jewish property buyers to exert pressure in order to decrease the value of the Jewish real estate to be sold. The report by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs acknowledged that the whole situation was in the eye of the international media, and the Greek diplomatic missions abroad faced unfavorable situations with continuous articles in the press criticizing the Greek official stance. Although Greece was among the first to enact laws supporting the restitution of the Jewish properties, it was among the last to implement them. That was the case. However, an exogenous condition, the situation in the Middle East, became the new spotlight of interest for Greece, implicating, somehow we managed to do it, the Greek Jewish fortunes. In 1947, the UN partition plan, based on the resolution 181, recommended the creation of a Jewish state and an Arab state. This was actually the partition plan of UN. Greece was the only European country to vote against the partition plan, favoring the Arabs that rejected it. This stance by the Greek side was dictated, as told, or as assumed, because of the Greek interests in the Middle East. Like, we had the important presence of a Greek community of some thousands of Greeks in Alexandria in Egypt, or the operation of the Greek Orthodox patriarchate in Jerusalem and Antiochia, since both of them had mainly Arab flock. Although this is true, scholar work from Anika Nachmani or Yannis Stefanidis and Manolis Koumas reveals some interesting details and exposes the furious anti-communism of the Greek diplomacy, which accused the Israelis for ties with the Soviet Union. More or less, the creation of a Jewish state, according to the Greek official, would add a communist spot in the Middle East, threatening the Greek interests. Moreover, it turns out that the Greek diplomat and later politician who carved Greece's foreign policy at that time period, Panagiotis Pipinellis, was a pure anti-Semite. After the creation of the State of Israel and the end of the first Israel-Arab conflict in 1949, Greece de facto recognized Israel. However, the jure recognition would take more than 40 years to be accomplished. It will be in 1990. So during this situation, Greece implicated the creation of OPAIE, the Organization for the Relief and the Restitution of the Jewish properties, that was the aim, with the developments in the Middle East. To any surprise, the Greek side informed KIS, the central board for the Jewish communities in Greece that was established immediately after the war, and informed one of the most prominent members of the Greek Jews, Aser Moises, that the establishment of the organization to restitute the Greek Jewish property will be determined only after the resolve of the issues concerning Greek properties and real estate in the new territories that became part of the newborn state of Israel. Practically, to the modest protests of Greek and international Jewish organizations, an internal issue of Greece, that means the restitution of properties of Greeks of Jewish religion, became an international bilateral issue between Greece and Israel, speculating that the issue had to do with the great estates the Greek Patriarchate of Jerusalem had, and still has actually. When this was solved satisfactorily for the Greek side, everyone expected that the deadlock would be over. However, it turned out that the greatest obstacle was the property owned by the wife of a Greek prominent politician and diplomat, Mr. Politis, in the Brenner neighborhood of Tel Aviv. So practically, some thousands of people and thousands of properties in Greece were pending to the issue of one property of one individual in the Middle East. To end this episode, the Jewish National Fund organization intervened, purchased the land by Mrs. Politis, and a few weeks later, in March 1949, OPAIE, the Organization for the Relief and Rehabilitation of Greek Jews, finally was established with a royal decree. It took almost 5 years after the end of the war in Greece and 3 years after the first law to form the legal entity that would claim the return of the Jewish assets. I will close here the first part of my presentation, and I will ask my associates to follow and give their papers. After they will finish, I will elaborate shortly about the operation of OPAIE and the outcomes of our research. First in the row is Mr. Nikos Kekeris, who will talk about the legal framework for the restitution of the Jewish properties and what actually Greece enacted at the end. Nico, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Good evening. Thank you all for honoring us with your presence today. I wish you all to stay safe and healthy during these difficult times. My contribution to the research project deals with the Greek legislation regarding the Jews of Thessaloniki from the liberation and annexation of the city to Greece up until 1949, when OPAIE was created. The turning points of this period were quite a few. Today, I will try to focus on some of them, beginning from the invasion of Greece by the Axis powers. After the capitulation of Greece in April 1941, the occupying forces had absolute governing power. The quisling governments were not bodies of power, but only instruments of the occupying forces. They ruled by legislative decrees in order to carry out the orders of the occupiers while they were promoting their own interests and the interests of their collaborators, aiming at the period after the war. In the areas occupied by Germany, in which Thessaloniki belonged, racial laws against the Jews were not enforced immediately. The forced gathering of Jews on the Black Sabbath in July 1942 has prevailed as the first large-scale act of persecution against the Jews of Thessaloniki. Actually, it was the first public act of ill treatment of Jews in Thessaloniki. However, 3 months earlier, by order of the military administration of Thessaloniki Aegean, members of the military, those able for conscription, and the Jews, including women, were banned from traveling to cross-border areas in Greece. This was the first act of persecution aimed specifically at the Jews by the occupying authorities. A month later, in May 1942, the legislation regarding the administration and financial control of Jewish communities was amended. The law provided that the occupying forces had the ability to exploit financially the Jews whenever they pleased. The Black Sabbath marked the beginning of the inhumane treatment of Jews. Forced labor followed and led many Jews to death, while the occupying forces were pressing the community to gather an insurmountable amount of money in order to free the Jews from suffering. Moreover, Nazis forced the expropriation of the Jewish cemetery of Thessaloniki, which in December 1942 was vandalized in its entirety. During the next 3 months, all measures that led the Jews of Thessaloniki to their death were imposed directly with orders by the military administration of Thessaloniki Aegean. With such an order began the systematic plundering of the goods belonging to Jews. On March 1st, 1943, Jews of Thessaloniki were ordered to declare their assets. The Jewish community was tasked with the administration of the cash and valuables belonging to Jews, while all bank deposits were gathered in one account at Merton's disposal. The Agency for the Custody of Jewish Properties, EDIP, began its activities in March 1943, but it was not legally existent until 3 months later. Law 205 was enacted retroactively in order to cover the actions of EDIP. The law provided that the Jewish properties would be managed by administrators, custodians, or caretakers, while the state will not be liable for the consequences. It is obvious that from all the persecutory measures against the Jews, only a few were given a legal facade. A possible explanation would be that the facade was used to delude the Jews and was no more needed, or that the measures were so cruel that their imposition had to be equally harsh. Another explanation is grounded on the nature of the measures that were chosen to be imposed with legislative decrees. From all the crimes that compose the Holocaust of the Greek Jews, only those related to their plunder were established by law. Should we view Nazi orders as law? The debate is about the morality of law, according to the concepts of natural and positive law. However, a system that imposes such rules providing for cruel crimes may not be considered a legal system, even according to positivism. That is because the Nazi system encouraged violations, imposed measures retroactively, and used terrorism in order to evade even the minimum standards of legality. A relevant example is the law establishing Idlib, which was published 3 months after the beginning of the deportation of Jews and the confiscation of their properties. Apart from its retroactivity, the law was the end result of a series of orders that were imposed at gunpoint. Therefore, it cannot be considered a product of a legal system. Formally, the occupying authorities maintained the legal system in Greece. It was an occupied and not an annexed country. The occupiers held the true power of action and overstepped violently any legal obstacle that stood in their way. This emphasizes the personal responsibility of the enforcers and collaborators of the occupying authorities who overstepped natural and positive laws, as well as the responsibility of those institutions that failed to act against the persecution. After the war, the turbulent political and economic situation and the civil war hindered the survivors' rehabilitation. The wartime laws were abolished immediately, and the Central Jewish Board was established in 1945. However, the legal framework for the claim and the return of the Jewish properties was incomplete. As a result, many Jewish properties remained in the hands of their occupants, custodians, or others. The law on the return of the properties under custody did not cover all the cases of Jewish properties that changed hands during the occupation. There were properties that were sold during the war and those that were rented as well. Firstly, all property transactions conducted during the occupation were declared invalid by law, and mortgaging the properties concerned was prohibited. However, it was not until 1949 that a law that provided which types of properties fell under its protection and the way that they could be claimed back. That was for the properties that were sold. In the cases of rented houses and shops, the law on rental extension provided that the original tenants or their heirs up to the third degree for houses and up to the second degree for shops could ask their resettlement in the property. The president of the court of first instance decided on the claim and could order the use of the property by more than one tenant or by both the owner and the tenant. Since October 1947, tenants had no more the right of resettlement. The custodians or caretakers that were still in possession of properties were now regarded as tenants. Moreover, the enforcement of all decisions ordering the eviction of custodians was suspended until the 13th of September 1949. Until that year, the legal framework regarding Jewish properties was incomplete. It was then that OPAE was established, although the law provided for it since 1946, 3 years earlier. This way, the issue of Greek Jewish properties was universally regulated. The law provided that all persons and legal entities that managed Jewish property should hand them over to the new organization. However, Greek Jews had already been deprived for more than 4 years of the assistance that could be offered to them by an organization tasked with their rehabilitation and administration of their properties. Thank you all for your time and attention. Back to you, Mr. Bouroutis.
Thank you very much, Nikos. Nikos had a point that it's quite important to understand the problem that was with the enaction of the Greek laws. Many thousands of the commercial plots of the commercial establishment, Jewish ones, were tenanted, were rented. They weren't owned, meaning that the owner was probably a Greek Christian, but the tenant, before the deportation, was a Greek Jew. Practically, after the war, very few of them were restored, since most of the people were perished in the Holocaust. Their relatives, the claimants, the heirs of this, they couldn't take them back. As Nico said, it was in 1947 that the law didn't give any provisions more in order to be claimed. So people couldn't claim to get back the stores or the enterprises that were rented out of Greek Christian property. Practically meaning that the tenants, that the custodians, the trustees that had this, whether these were shops or factories, they kept them. It's a great issue, and it was a pending issue till 1949, 1950. And even the Greek Christian owners of the properties were protesting because the custodians were still there and they couldn't get their properties back. That is why also this report that I mentioned of the Greek Foreign Ministry said that they gave up their legal rights, the heirs of the properties of the Jewish commercial enterprises, and they were leaving at a symbolic price. So I will give now the microphone to Ms. Xenia Eleftheriou, who was an associate and a valuable associate in our program. We wanted to make somehow to do a comparison with what happened in other areas with the liquidation of the Jewish properties. So we think that it was the most proper case was to use the Bulgarian case that occupied the northeast territories of Greece and deported the Greek Jewish communities of Drama, of Seres, of Kavala, of Komotini, Alexandroupoli. And almost all of these communities perished during the Holocaust. So what we did is that we used the work that was conducted by Professor Avramov, that he published with one of his associates, a number of Bulgarian documents about the handling of the Greek Jewish properties in the towns that were at the control of the Bulgarians. And we use them, we translate them in order to see how this liquidation process was formed in these towns. So Ms. Xenia Eleftheriou will elaborate on that. And I'm glad that we have Professor Rumer Avramov with us in the audience today. Xenia, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Welcome, and from me. I will open my speaking with three basic historical questions. Was the anti-Semitic policy in Southeast European countries imposed exclusively by the Germans? Did the German allies have a choice? The name of the Bulgarian law for the protection of the nation needs to be analyzed as well. Did the Bulgarian or any other nation really have to protect itself against the Jews? Bulgarian Jews faced intense anti-Jewish persecution, including forced relocation and brutal labor battalions, yet avoided deportation to death camps. deportation orders were signed but encountered strong oppositions by some intellectuals and significantly the Bulgarian Orthodox Church. Bulgarian deputies protested against the deportation of Jews. The protest statement dates 26 December 1943 from the vice chairman of the 25th session of the Bulgarian National Assembly, PSEF, and 42 other deputies to the Prime Minister against the deportation of the Jews beyond the Bulgarian borders. They insist that the new anti-Jewish measures be based on the real political interests and on the ethnical views of the Bulgarian people. Bulgaria did, however, deport foreign Jews in occupied territories. In March 1943, it arrested over 7,000 Macedonian and 4,000 Thracian Jews from deportation to the Treblinka death camp. The article attempts to study the looting of Jewish property in the Bulgarian occupied areas of Greece. Archival material from the book The Deportation of the Jews from Western Thrace, Vardas, Macedonia and Pirot, March 1943, documents from the Bulgarian archives was used to the needs. The book consists of 609 documents from the Bulgarian archives related to the displacement and sale of the Jewish property of the Greek and Yugoslav territories that were under Bulgarian occupation. From the total amount of the documents, some were selected and we made the official translation of them. More specifically, the report of Dr. Ivan Popov, General Inspector of the Committee on Jewish Affairs, is being considered for the liquidation of the Jewish assets in the Aegean region. Popov's report is sent to Sofia on April 7 of 1943 to the Commissioner for Jewish Affairs, Alexander Belev, and examined 4 different issues. First, the Jewish concentration campaign. Second, the collection and storage of Jewish movable property. Third, the preparation and sale of objects. And fourthly, the management and rental of Jewish houses. Special issues are also mentioned. Typical is the example of Komotini, where Popov asks the financial bailiff of the municipality of Gimurdzina, Komotini, Kyros Mokov, who handed over valuables worth over 600,000 lev to receive a monetary reward of 5,000 lev. In general, we would say that following the example of Nazi Germany, the expropriation of Jewish property by Bulgaria began with the preparation of the legal and institutional framework around the Jewish question. Both Nazi Germany and Bulgaria laid the foundations for the institutionalized and systematic looting of Jewish property, first in their own territories and then in the territories they owned. According to Popov's secret report, the commissions organized and carried out the registration of Jewish property and the deportation of Jews to predetermined areas in the hinterland with great success. The Jewish houses were registered and sealed by the local police authorities in order to be rented to Bulgarian settlers under the under the responsibility of the police and a rent set by Municipal Housing Committee. The expropriated Jewish property came to Bulgarian merchants and businessmen after it was rented or sold. The above position is reinforced by the fact that in Komotini, assets were quickly transferred to a company of German-Bulgarian interests under the pretext of serving the needs of the state services. As about the Jewish movable property, the process of registering and expropriating them was clearly more complicated and encountered more problems. This is due both to the volume and the multidimensional nature of the items, from food to furniture, as well as to petty theft, irregular loans, and more generally to the corruption of the Bulgarian local political and military authorities and the police. Small problems also arose from the fact that pure Christians illegally entered sealed houses to steal anything cheap left behind the Bulgarian authorities, and there were cases of widespread looting. Difficulties in the process of registering Jewish property arose, however, not only due to corruption, but also due to haste of local authorities, the involvement of prominent Bulgarian citizens in the process, and the difficulty in financially valuing the various confiscated items. More specifically, the two main problems were that the various committees on Jewish affairs often handed over items of low value along with various valuables, as well as their valuation in the Bulgarian currency leva. Thus, even personal belongings of the lowest value were looted before being deported to the Bulgarian and German concentration and extermination camps. After their registration and valuation, these items were either provided to government agencies to meet their operational needs or sold through auctions to Bulgarian civil servants and citizens. Part of the confiscated movable property, mainly food and clothing, was also subject to the status of distribution vouchers, i.e. it was distributed free of charge to Bulgarian citizens as a form of social benefit. The confiscated food or essentials were bought from merchants for resale. Merchants were required to include the goods they purchased in their statements, with which they reported to the local sales committee on the products concerned and sold them for distribution coupon scraps. The issue of registration of valuables was better settled in Kavala due to the action of police commander Asen Trifonov. 4 funds of the National Bank of Bulgaria were opened in Kavala, which collected all the valuables. The order was given to all the Jews to take their valuables and money with them to their temporary deportation camp. Thus, very little valuables remained in their homes before they were displaced. The procedure followed in the registration of Jewish property in the new territories was as follows. The local committee on Jewish affairs, with the assistance of the police, but also with the help of senior officials and other city bodies, and the involvement of prominent citizens, lawyers, etc., collected and recorded assets, leaving them either inside Jewish homes or storing them in public warehouses, drawn up appropriate foreclosure records. The recording of the assets by the Inspector General of the Committee on Jewish Affairs was necessary in order for them to be transferred to warehouses and then sold. The recordings were not accurate because the boxes, trunks with the items were loaded open, not arranged, and thus a large percentage of them were destroyed. In the case of Kavala, the transport was done in closed boxes, and for these reasons, they were accurately recorded. In Popov's report, we read that the exception was the case of Komotini, where the building of the Jewish community was used as a warehouse. With the exception of Kavala, steering the police commander, in all other cities, movable property was lost, according to Popov, at a rate of 50%, while in Komotini, this number, it was exceeded. Only Kavala, the household furniture was carefully placed in the warehouses and per household and in a prominent position. Popov's report on the preparation and sale of the items states that there have been several requests for different purposes from state institutions, bodies, and organizations. The money that would be collecting from the sale of the properties had to be deposited in the Jewish Communities Fund. Otherwise, the money from the sales revenue had to be deposited in a frozen account of the Jewish owner. In conclusion, the implementation of the expropriation of Jewish property and the deportation of Jews to the new lands was organized and carried out with an efficiency almost identical to that observed in the old territories of Bulgaria. The lion's share passed to the service of the Bulgarian industrial, craft, and commercial interests, as well as the state itself. Next priority was given to small and medium-sized Bulgarian traders and businessmen, while a small part of the confiscated Jewish property, mainly clothing and food, was given to the lower classes as a form of social policy. The Bulgarian state attempted the complicity of Bulgarian society through colonial and social policy, which was orchestrated over millions of deaths in death camps. The deportation of Greek Jews was also a way of securing additional financial resources for the Bulgarian state. An important finding is the negligible to non-existence involvement of the Greek element in the case of the looting of Jewish property in the areas under Bulgarian occupation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ksenia. This is the paper of Ksenia, and the general conclusion was that we had a liquidation of the Jewish movable wealth in the Bulgarian occupation zone, but the real estate, Jewish real estate, was preserved, meaning that it was saved. So I will give now a brief, just 5 minutes, about what happened with Wenopaie, the new state agency that it was controlled by the Greek Jews in Greece, was formed in order to restitute the Jewish property. So after the establishment, let me just give me a second, please. So I will check if my connection is okay. Yes. Can you hear me? Is it okay? All right. So after the establishment of OPAIE in March 1943, the new organization created offices all over Greece and in the towns where the Jewish communities were able to be reconstituted. Of course, the most important office was in Thessaloniki, since it had the biggest, and they had the biggest burden with a great number of confiscated properties. As it seemed, OPAIE office in Thessaloniki concentrated its effort to restore ownership over the Jewish real estate. This was the big stake at the moment that OPAIE was established. Since the formation of the office was in June 1949, it was more than 5 years practically after the end of the war, and 3 years after the first law that it was enacted by the Greek state to form this organization. So in these 5 years, it was a great period of time that many things could have been lost. So as I said, the biggest state was the Jewish real estate properties. For those that they were housed, or they were housed, whether these were houses or they were commercial establishment under tenancy, meaning that they were rented, all of them, probably the biggest part of them, perished, was lost, meaning that the Jews, if there was a Jewish businessman who had a commercial store or a business, an enterprise in a Greek ownership, in a Greek Christian real estate ownership, it could claim it. If he had survived, then the possibilities were that after some time, probably with court ruling, it could be delivered back, it could be turned back. But since they were claimants, in most of the cases, these were lost. Because actually what happened is that what the custodians did immediately when they were appointed as custodians, they sell out everything. They sell out everything, and either they change the business relationship in the store, in the enterprise they had, or they subleased it to a third party. So practically, if a claimant, if a relative or someone who perished in the Holocaust was asking to get back the Jewish enterprise that it was that it was rented, practically there was nothing to be retrieved. There was nothing, everything was lost. So what it did, that since the formation of OPAIE in June 1949 in Thessaloniki, and for 6 months, all those who claimed legal inheritance rights were able to apply to OPAIE to form an application to receive their property or the properties of the relatives who perished in the Holocaust. After this 6 months period, they had to address to the local courts. Eligible to exert legal claims were relatives up to 4th grade of relationship. In many cases, OPAIE had to do thorough checks in relationship status and administer the properties for years before handing them over to the legal beneficiaries. There were also cases that no relative remained alive to exert inheritance rights, and OPAIE kept the management of the properties for good. The first thing the few OPAIE employees did in Thessaloniki, if someone will have access to OPAIE archives, it will be quite understandable the difficulties that they witnessed since they started this whole operation. So what the few employees did in Thessaloniki was to set up a system to follow concerning each Jewish real estate, and soon enough spent lots of time in the land registry agency. The land registry agency is still the state bureaucratic organization that controls all ownership in Greece. And it has several offices around Greece. So what they did, the employees, they went in the land registry agency and they checked everything that had to do with Jewish property, real estate dealing, selling or purchased during the war. The Greek state after the war, as Nikos Kekeris said, provisioned the annulment of all transactions during the occupation, because in most of the cases, it happened for urgent reasons and needs and below market prices. What actually happened is that people that were in need, we had a great famine in Greece during the first occupation, couple of occupation years till 1942, that many people in need sell out their properties in order to survive. So what the laws in 1946 and 1949 is that they annulled these transactions. So OPAE checked hundreds of these cases and exerted its legal rights in courts, meaning it took hundreds of cases of selling of Jewish property in court. In most of the cases, a compromise between the sellers and the buyers is noted with a supplementary payment at market prices. So IDIP, that used to be the agency that was managing, administering the Jewish properties, started handing over to OPAE hundreds of files concerning Jewish real estate properties that needed to be thoroughly checked by OPAE employees. It took years for OPAE to restore order, and in the final period, the strongest reactions was made by the groups of trustees of the custodians, and they were noted in 1950 and 1951. Since they formed a new union of trustees, and in 1951, they proceeded in local protests to revert the situation. The truth is that in the period 1946 to 1949, they have succeeded in the goal of keeping the Jewish properties. The report of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in 1947 acknowledged that the custodians formed a strong group of interests exerting influence in the political scene and collided with lawful order. In the webpage of our program that we will try to give you a small outlook later, there is a public announcement that the custodians made in 1951. It was discovered by a good colleague, Dimitris Goulis, who shared it with us. We are much obliged to him. The announcement by this union of custodian trustees demanded the dissolution of OPAE, the write-off, the cancellation of all of their debts of the custodians, since they were outstanding unpaid rentals for years, the annulment of all evictions of the trustees, and the demand the custodians to be appointed indefinite caretakers of the Jewish commercial establishment. More or less, the Greek Christian trustees asked the implementation of the German Aryanization of Jewish properties program. Their effort was in vain, since the establishment of OPAE marked an irreversible development. The law was very specific. All individual or state agencies had to deliver the administration of the properties to the new organization, to OPAE. Since IDIP, till the establishment of OPAE, had returned around 350 to 400 Jewish real estate properties, practically less than 10%, in total almost 5 years after the end of the war, this burden was at the hands of OPAE. Using administrators, mechanical engineers, lawyers, notaries, etc., the new organization checked thoroughly each Jewish real estate property received and carefully matched inheritance applications. That's why in some cases the return of properties took years to be fulfilled because of the bureaucratic procedures and the detailed checking of relationship status. And actually, even courts were involved during this procedure. Our program had, as I said, as focal point of research, the two named streets, Venizelos and Miaouli. I will ask briefly of my associate, Angeliki Gavrilou, to talk to you about some cases of Miauli and Venizelos, because it's a micro-history that somehow gives the story of the people, what happened to them and what happened to their properties. Okay, so we did, but the program and that was, we checked these two streets and we did a sampling checking in other streets associated with the fortunes of the residents of Venizelos and Miauli. And we didn't find any loss of real estate in the cases that we checked. The general outcome we came to is a great loss of movable assets and wealth, and the rescue of the Jewish real estate properties. Although we can't rule out possible losses, our program didn't find in the real estate part. However, there are cases like the neighborhood 151, that it was a communal property that needs thoroughly again to be checked, and of Western Thessaloniki. Western Thessaloniki is a case that it's quite important, since we detected we detected a kind of a problem. What happened is that in the western part of Thessaloniki, we had hundreds of Jewish real estate properties. These properties, houses mainly, they weren't of a great value. The western part of Thessaloniki was from, let's say, low to middle class residents. What happens there is that we had in at least 145 Jewish houses, we had the intervention of another estate agency. It's called the Agency for the Exchange Properties, that intervened to OPAIE and said that it had legal rights over the plots. What happened in this case is, and this probably is why we have the public history about what happened with the Jewish property. The truth is that in 1917, Thessaloniki suffered a great catastrophe with a fire in the center of the city. Almost 70,000 people were left homeless. 2/3 out of these people were Jews. So the Jews, after the fire, they were spread in the outskirts of the city, many of whom were settled in the western part. In some cases, the local authorities constructed houses in the western part. It's a neighborhood called Anoxyrokrini in Neapoli, that it's named today the neighborhood. They constructed around 50 houses. When we talk about houses at that time, we're talking about plain constructions of a couple of rooms, just a small yard, nothing more. And they formed them in plots that it was considered as public land after the forcible population exchange in 1923 between Greece and Turkey. All Muslim population, all Muslim residents of Thessaloniki left and went to Turkey. Their land was later claimed to be public land. So some of the houses, of the Jewish houses, were constructed in years later claimed public land. So in 1949, 1950, when OPAIE tried to administer these properties, we have another state agency, the Agency for the Exchange Properties, Exchange Muslim Properties, that intervened and said that OPAIE doesn't have any kind of legal claims of the Jewish houses, because it belongs, the land, the plot, it belongs to the public, to the Greek public state. The problem is that all these Jewish houses, we're talking about hundreds of them, they were squats immediately after the deportation of the Jews. They're by Greek Christians. All of them were occupied by Greek Christians, and they even formed an association after the end of the war, and they call themselves the residents of Jewish houses in Neapoli. So still, we need to clarify if these properties were delivered to the state finally, or in some cases, legal rights were exerted by the new occupants. So this is the general outcome. I will ask now Angeliki Gavrilogou, who is associate to the program, to give a small of 4 or 5 cases in Niaouli and Venizelos Street about what happened. It's a kind of microhistory context that it's quite interesting. I want, before Angeliki will start, I would like just to say that the outcome of the program is beyond the webpage that we will show you briefly. It's a volume that will be published, unfortunately, in Greek in the beginning, next month by Alexandria Publications, and all the associates in the program and the colleague Areti Makri from the General State Archives have contributed with their articles. It has to do, everything has to do with the Jewish assets of Thessaloniki. Angeliki, thank you very much, and you can start.
Good evening. I would also like to welcome you and thank you for being here today. It would have been ideal, but simultaneously impossible, for us to have searched every Jewish property in the city. That is why, as it has already been mentioned, this research project focused on 2 streets of Thessaloniki. Niaouli was a street inhabited by many Jewish families. We were able to locate 30 Jewish properties. Additionally, there were Jewish families that didn't own houses, but instead rented just a room. One could find all kinds of properties, either 2 or 3-story houses, or even small and plain constructions of just a couple of rooms. However, according to the information found on the Declaration of Property they had to fill out in March 1943, on German orders, the majority lived in one room and shared one space, usually the kitchen, regardless of their ownership status. It is also worth mentioning that some of these properties were owned by women due to the tradition of dowry. Venizelos, which at the time was called Vasileos Konstantinou, is a street that has always been in the center of the city's commercial life. There we found 14 Jewish properties, mainly commercial ones, which reflect the socio-economic status of their owners. Moreover, we were able to find there stores, offices, as well as small apartments rented by both Jews and Christians. Via the information provided by the OPAIE archives and the historical archive of the Jewish community of Thessaloniki, we were able to reconstruct not only the pre-war and post-war history of these Jewish properties, but also the stories of the people who lived there. From the Jewish owners, the majority of whom were murdered at the concentration camps, to refugees who arrived in Thessaloniki from the Bulgarian occupied zone. From the people who were relocated due to the creation of the ghetto in the eastern part of the city, to the collaborators who benefited from their relation with the occupying forces. Today, I will briefly present 4 of those stories. The property on Niaouli 34th Street has an interesting story. It was in 1930 when Sabetai Almosnino bought it from Avram Howell, only to sell half of it to Jacques Matalon a few years later in May 1942. Jacques sold his share a few months later to a Christian buyer. What is important here is the day of that transaction. After a research into the land registry of Thessaloniki, it was revealed that the transaction took place on the 18th of July 1942, a week after what is known as the Black Saturday. It is possible that Jacques Matalon was one of the men in Platia Eleftherias, and it was his fear that made him sell his share of the house. After the war, this transaction was not annulled, and no one claimed Jacques' part of the property. During the first couple of years, OPAIE annulled several similar transactions that took place during the occupation, but not this one. Possibly, according to OPAIE, this was a lawful transaction. The other half of this property belonged to Sabetai Almosnino, who who along with his wife Oreta and their children, Sarika and Elia, were deported and then murdered at Auschwitz-Birkenau. In 1943, IVIP established there two caretakers. The first caretaker, Vita Kappa, was an infantry major. According to the inventory, the house was not totally looted, as the majority of the Jewish properties were. Some of the furniture were still there, part of which even in good condition. The second caretaker was He Sigma, a teacher at the 12th public primary school that was not far from his new apartment. Without a doubt, he must have known about the 12 Jewish students who attended his school during the school year 1942-1943. In August 1946, the Jewish community of Athens acknowledged the death of Sabbatai Almosnino and his family. The only survivor was his wife's brother, who finally got the property from a paie, which he had sold by 1952. The property on Miaouli 3 belonged to the Simsi family. In 1954, the Jewish community of Thessaloniki declared Rafael Simsi, his wife Aliki, and their son Sabi dead. They were all murdered at Auschwitz-Birkenau concentration camp. The only survivors were Aliki's brothers. Since May 1943, IVIP established there the caretaker Delta P, as well as Alpha Delta, with his family, who was a refugee from Grevena. During the inventory, the only thing found was a nearly destroyed buffet. By June of 1943, the caretaker Rama Mi was established there along with his family of 9 members. He was also a refugee from Grevena. Another caretaker was Itaro. The inventory revealed a situation difficult to describe. It seems that the entire house was plundered, and even the doors were missing. And the few furniture which remained were almost completely destroyed. The property in Venizelos 34 was known as Megaron Elysia and belonged to the members of the Aelion and Ben Susan families. Some members of those families survived the Nazi persecutions, while others never returned to Thessaloniki. Before the war, one could find there the store named Moïse Fais and Company. In 1943, IVIP established there 3 caretakers, Vita Hi, Vita P, and Kappa Gamma. All 3 of them were accused of being collaborators, and in 1945, the Governor General decided to give the store to 4 different caretakers. The post-war story of this particular store and the following litigation against the collaborators is interesting, and at the same time sheds light to the way the Greek state dealt with the caretakers during the post-war years. One of those men, Kappa Gamma, had 2 different charges for collaboration with the enemy. In the first one, the surviving family of Moïse Fais accused the 3 caretakers of acting against the commands of the Nazi authorities and of selling not only the merchandise, but also most of the furniture they found in the store. That led to a loss of 70 million drachmas. In addition, they sublet the store to others. The case closed in 1947 after the Greek Gendarmerie and the National Security Department of Thessaloniki concluded that there was not enough evidence of collaboration with the Germans. It is worth mentioning that the authorities could not locate the 3 men, one of whom was German, and had fled the city with the departing German forces. The second charge was for Kappa Gamma as a sole case. He was accused of collaboration as he was an interpreter for the Gestapo, firstly in Orestiada, his hometown, and later in Thessaloniki. He was also accused of having befriended Nazi officers and finally of seizing 2 Jewish properties. It was proven that he followed a German officer from Orestiada to Thessaloniki, and immediately after his arrival, he was given an apartment in Venizelos 49th Street, evicting the 3 refugee families that lived there, but also the store of Moïse Fais. Although the evidence was more than enough, he was acquitted due to doubts. Finally, on Venizelos Street, number 3, one could find the property of Samuel Bourla, which at the time was known as Megaron Bourla, while today it is named Stoa Levi Menexen. Before the war, the store of Isaac Siaki was located there. In 1943, after a command from the German authorities, Idip established there the caretaker Kappa Taf. We know all the details of how the whole procedure took place. Only on the 5th of November 1943, at 10 o'clock in the morning, the representatives of Idip and the new caretaker gathered in front of the store for the official handover. The merchandise, as well as the furniture, was thoroughly evaluated. For example, the worth of the 15 embroidered curtains was 75,000 drachmas, while the destroyed velvet tablecloth had zero value. On the whole, the worth of the merchandise was approximately 10 million drachmas, while the worth of the furniture reached 5,000 drachmas. Everything was given to the caretaker to be managed because, according to Idip, he was a diligent and sensible family man. Finally, since the service did not have the keys, they had to trespass the property. Finally, Samuel Bourla survived the Nazi persecutions and claimed his property from Opaye. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Toda, Angeliki. And I don't see any kind of questions. Actually, we have finished our papers, and I think that it's a good chance that Nico, if you can, Nico Kekeri, if you can show us a little bit, share your screen, you can give us a small tour in the web page. What I wanted to tell you is that the web page is in two versions, in Greek and in English, and it will be enriched. So it's the first part. The main what we wanted to do is to reconstruct. This is our aim, to reconstruct how the situation was in the war. Okay, Nico, you have the microphone. You can give a brief outlook of the webpage.
Okay, thank you. This is our website. It is our pride and joy. All the interesting results of our research are presented here with some key points of the history of the Jews that are more elaborated in the book. At first, at the home page, you have a brief description of the research project and the contributors. You can go to the lists for the properties. First, there is the properties and Opaye, how Opaye managed the Jewish properties during the occupation, at the end of the war, and the relevant legislation. It is in three parts: before the war, pre-war legislation, during the occupation, and the legislation after the end of the war and the occupation. And each list, each item has also the link to the original
Government Gazette.
Yes, of the government gazette. So you can see for yourself how the laws were enacted back then through the official Greek state as the Nazis wanted. So then we go to Thessaloniki, the city itself. It's really interesting to see the city as it became part of Greece, and how Jews linked their story with Thessaloniki story, and where Thessaloniki was some a characteristic for their character. They were Thessalonians, and Thessaloniki was mother of Israel, and how this happened during the period after their arrival here, the centuries. Then we go to the interwar period, the war and occupation, which is the time that really affects the Jews, and they are led to their death from the Black Sabbath and on, as they are targeted, and the post-war Thessaloniki.
This is the announcement. If you can stop here
Yes.
pause it. This is the announcement, the public announcement of the custodians that they made it on 16th April 1951 in order to invite in a committee, in an assembly, to exert their rights, how to protect and not to return back the Jewish fortunes, the Jewish properties. It was one of the last ones of the actions that they did, and since it's quite hostile because it makes a specific and intentional deviation between Greeks and Jews. That Jews are not Greeks, and because the Jews are hostile and they want to take back their properties, and the Greeks, we have to react on this in this action. This is a clear indication that the establishment of OPAIE was the great step in order to restitute the Jewish properties. Nico, you can go to the maps, to the digital maps.
Of course. So we have the streets, the Venizelos Street and the Mniaouli, which were the focal points of the research. Each street has the map where you can see for yourself. Let it load. Nikos Pachtas was the designer of the web page and made a really wonderful work presenting the results. You can see micro stories, such the stories that Angeliki described before. So when you click at each point on the map, you can see the relevant story, the story that that has to do with this particular building. For me, now that I presented to you, it's really it affects me emotionally, because there are streets that we are walking each day here in Thessaloniki, and it's really interesting to know how life was back then and how the persons that lived there were affected by war and occupation. The same goes and below the map there are all the stories all together, so that you can find them, and of course you can also click on the map to read them. And the same goes with Mniaouli. After a brief description of the street and the Jewish buildings on the street, you can go to Mniaouli map, also with the focal points, the buildings that are there and became part of the research, and their story. Of course, the webpage is open to new stories, to everyone that has something to contribute about a particular building, especially in the streets, but all over Thessaloniki, a story that has to do with Jewish property, a photograph also, because it was really difficult to find photos from that time, from these particular streets, Mniaouli and Venizelos, showing the buildings as there were back then.
And the truth is that we
share the page, share the web page.
Yes, please. And the truth is that we will reach this web page with more streets when we will be able. And I believe that after the publication of the book, it will be easier for us to gather more information and share them in the web page. It's a quite interesting issue. It's quite unknown still what happened with the Jewish assets. This is also the thing with the Jewish with the digital map that Nikos now is showing to you, that you can show it, that you can see it actually how it is today. I mean, with the pins, you can see, for instance, in the corner of the street that Nikos is showing to us, where the teens are, is the Gadenio school, is Miaouli 35. It used to be one of the private Jewish schools of Thessaloniki that it was closed in 1943 with the deportations. And then after the war, in the afterwar period, it became a public school, a public Greek public school. At the end of the 70s, it suffered some damages from the earthquake and still needs some reparations in order to be in the on its former condition. Still, though, it's quite interesting to see the resemblance and how it was, the Jewish properties with how today these streets is their outlook. And I believe that we can step out from the webpage, Nico, and return to see our audience, if it's possible. I don't know if anybody's going to do it. Okay. The truth is, it's quite difficult when we talk to monitors. The pandemic changed completely our lives, and it's quite, it's quite, let's say, you feel a little bit weird, strangely, when you talk to a microphone and to a camera that you don't see most of the times anyone. It happens in my classes. I barely see any of my students. Anyway, I would like to ask you if you have any questions, and also if anyone wants to talk, and he can raise his hand, or I think there's a button that it can do so. I'm not quite sure if anyone would like to. Okay, I don't see any kind of reactions. Practically, I don't see very well. Okay, yes, Miss Howell. Is that
Hello.
correct?
Hello.
Hello.
Thank you for your presentation. My name is Yara Haskiel. My grandfather is a Holocaust survivor from Thessaloniki. Unfortunately, he's not living anymore. But I have a question to clarify, because as you mentioned, a Holocaust survivor who were not being able to come back to Thessaloniki after the war, basically they were not able to claim any property, as I understood you right, because it was just in a period of 6 months. So my question would be concerning as well to Vadaris and Ramona, which is the part above. If you have conducted any research in this case, that would be my first short question. And my second question would be, since you are on the Jewish Studies faculty in Thessaloniki, and I think I will come soon to Thessaloniki as well, but my question would be, how do you deal in the faculty in terms of education and student-wise with being on the cemetery of the former Jewish cemetery, and how do you approach these archives, or have these archives? I mean, I know the books of Nar and Saltiel, of course, and I have studied this. I'm conducting my own PhD, but from an artistic perspective. So I would also kindly ask you, in what sense are you dealing with this question nowadays? And then to finish, I would thank you, because it's a very valuable research. And I think also, since I know Angeliki's work, the question of microhistories here plays a crucial role in terms of understanding really the lives and the microhistories that for me are the most. I mean, we also have to study the macrohistories, of course, to understand, but the microhistories that somehow makes me always quite emotional, also in terms of what Rika Beneviste had wrote already. So thank you for that again.
We want to thank you for participating and for your intervention. So let me clear this out. Jewish real estate properties were administered by OPAE. In the beginning, since OPAE established in March 1949, and the office in Thessaloniki was established in June 1949, for 6 months, the claimants, whether these were survivors or were their relatives, they are the heirs of the ones who perished in the Holocaust, could apply directly to OPAE. After this 6 months period, they could go to the Greek court and ask for the properties to be handed to them. That is why a big part of OPAE's operation went through the courts. In this 6 months period, some thousands of applications were made. I don't remember, I can't recall the number at the moment, but I think there were more than 2,000. After that, more than 1,000 applications were made through courts. That is why the claimants could go to court even 10 or 15 years afterwards. The point is that in some cases, as I mentioned, in the western part of Thessaloniki, there was an issue that needs still to clarify about the property status, since some of these properties were claimed to be on public land. Concerning Rezi Vardar and Ramona, that is also one of the 3 or 4 neighborhoods, Agia Paraskevi, Agia Fotini, and Rezi Vardar, were the neighborhoods that we had these kind of cases. Rezi Vardar was a neighborhood on the western part of Thessaloniki, and it was coined as that because of the Rezi tobacco factory that used to operate there. And in the surroundings, the constructions were made by Jews who were employed in the Jewish, in the tobacco factory. So all this area was named as Rezi Vardar. A part of Rezi Vardar, was named as Ramona because of a club, of a Jewish taverna that used to operate there. And today, the police station that it's in the upper part of the railway station, of the central railway station of Thessaloniki, is named Ramona because it's exactly where the location of Ramona was. In this area, also, the state claimed legal rights and ownership of the land. So probably it belongs to that. If you want, you can email us about certain details of that to check it. It was quite difficult. The archives are scattered, are fragmented, but the biggest part of them are digitalized thanks, and they were saved thanks to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington. And actually it's preserved in Kis, in Athens, and Bella Aron, who is responsible as an archivist of the OPAE archives, give us a great deal of support in our work. So this is the case about the Ramona Rezi Vardar. I remember exactly that there were at least 18 houses that they were constructed after the fire of 1917, that they were, excuse me, that they housed Jews, that they were left homeless in Rezi Vardar. And after the war, only one survived and came back. The 17 houses were sacked, were by squatters. They were occupied by Greek Christians. The same applied for a number also of Jewish residences in the western part. Now, concerning, it's a little bit difficult to understand the situation, to visualize that all the buildings at the Aristotle University of Thessaloniki were part of the Jewish cemetery. And there were a small part also, it was the Muslim cemetery, but anyway, we distracted that, early in the 1920s. The biggest point was the issue, was the destruction of the Jewish cemetery during the occupation. it's quite difficult for a young student when he's or she's 20 years old to understand the situation, to visualize that this was the area of the biggest cemetery, Jewish cemetery in Europe. So the Jewish studies, the chair of Jewish studies that I'm not part, I conduct the research program in the chair of Jewish studies by Yorgos Antoniou, who is the professor of the Department of History in Thessaloniki and in charge of it. They make a quite important work in order to restructure how the situation was. Because the main problem in Greece at the moment is that anti-Semitism is still an issue. You can't give numbers and percentages, but still prejudices and problems faced with anti-Semitism that had also to deal with the Israeli state, that it's a complete methodological error, still are an issue. And this is the effort of the people, of all of us, that we are dealing with the past, with the Jewish history of Thessaloniki. We want to make the Jewish history of Thessaloniki to be part of the historical narration of the city, of the context, because it wasn't only the Holocaust. We want also to concentrate in the Jewish life, in the social life, in the cultural life, as a big part, probably the biggest part of Thessaloniki till the Second World War. I don't know if I answered to your questions about that. It's a difficult procedure, but I think that over the last year, we have made some progress. Anyone else that want to say something or raise its hand digitally? I see that also Sai Zurgo is with us, and I don't see because it's in Jewish. Gila, is that you? Okay, so if we don't have anything else, probably we can close somewhere here.
The lady has something to say.
I don't see anything. Excuse me. My site. Gila. Excuse me. You want to talk? Oh
yes,
dear. Go ahead.
You didn't tell me that you do this, but it's amazing. Every time that I'm in Thessaloniki, I'm going, through the streets, and I know the people that live there, not in 43, 36, but it's the kind of project that everybody wants to do. It's very, very, very interesting. And I will enter and see what I know, not about assets, but about the streets and the people that live there. You used our Rekanati book?
No, not yet. No, we didn't.
Because in our Rekanati, it's not all the Jews of Thessaloniki, but you can find the streets and the number of the streets and who lives there actually. If somebody is in Israel or in the United States, but the family, how many people, they have assets. And for the Rajiv Ardar, I think that the people that came back from the mountains, they claimed for their houses. It was not houses, it was little rooms with 10 or 12 people inside.
Exactly, because in some cases we identified, it's the cases were so many that it was quite difficult to reestablish everything in order.
Of course.
And the pandemic also was a problem because we didn't have access to the archives. We were trying to see the gaps when the market was open and the offices were open, that we were, in some cases, for instance, Bella Aron in Athens or Areti Makri in the General State Archives in Thessaloniki, they were opening unofficially the archives for us in order to conduct the research, and off the record, and they were opening so we can finish our work. And we
Good.
have to thank them. I think Bella is with us today. Hi,
I would
Bella.
like to help
Toda
you.
rabba.
Yes. Toda. Beautiful.
Gilad, also you were vaccinated. You in Israel, you are very lucky to be vaccinated. We are waiting still for our turn.
This Burla from Miaoli, no, Burla from Venizelos is the family of Albert Burla.
No, it's not. I think they are related, but it is not the one.
Ah, okay. Okay.
So
But they
anyone
came
else?
back from where? Yes.
Okay.
Good.
Anyone
Talk
else that
to him.
anyone else that wants to say something? No, I think it's almost 9 o'clock Greek time. So I would like to thank you very much for your participation, for your patience. I would like you to excuse us for any mistakes and errors that we did by speaking in English. It's not so easy for us that we are dealing in live in a session that it's through computer. But I think that it will be quite fruitful to talk again, and we will get back to you through our webpage, and you will receive a feedback of the publication of the book. Eventually, that the book will be also edited in English, and it will be possible to receive a bigger audience, a large audience. So this was that, and we believe that it's going to be an interesting project, and probably it will open this opportunity, to do more thorough research about Jewish life in Thessaloniki and the restitution of the Jewish history of the city. Thank you very much, Toda Rabba, and please take care of yourselves. Thank you very much for attending. Professor Rumen Avramov, thank you very much for being with us. And I see also Yakov Sibi that was with us, Nades Ragaru from France. Thank you very much for being with us. And hopefully we will be well also in the future. We will talk again together. Okay? Bye-bye. It was a pleasure. Cheers.